Oh, I hope you don't all have to leave. One more speaker who's come all the way from Miami to make a presentation today is Juan Martinez. Before I introduce him, I just wanted to make one remark that occurred to me during the presentation. I always forget to make a credit. You heard Asterio say we met in 2000 at the Havana Biennial. We have a very generous funder in this community for our Cuban artist exchanges, and that's the Victory Foundation. And that enabled about 14 faculty to go down to Havana and explore the arts, not only in visual arts, but in music, theater, and dance. That's Bob Franzblau. You might know him as Thompson Cigar. We're having some cigars that he's offered tonight that we'll give at the opening. So I just wanted to mention the Victory Foundation and Bob Franzblau for supporting focused support on our Cuban exchanges. Juan Martinez holds a PhD in art history and modern art from Florida State University. He has been an associate professor at Florida International University in Miami since 1996. He has presented a number of scholarly papers, including at the Wilfredo Lam Center for Contemporary Art in Havana for Lam's centennial birthday. Other scholarly papers include Contemporary Cuban Art, a synthesis of the national and the international, presented at Clarion University of Pennsylvania in 2001. From the Good Neighbor Policy to the Trade with the Enemy Act, Cuban art exhibitions in the United States, 1939 to 1995, he presented at Austin Museum of Art, and Imagining the Nation, Cuban Painting in the Republican Period, 1902 to 1958, presented at the Institute of Latin American Studies in London. He has also numerous published articles, catalog essays, exhibition and book reviews. He does have a book, Cuban Art and National Identity, which addresses the vanguardia painters, which was published in 1994. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Juan Martinez.
I would like to thank Noelle Smith and Margaret Miller for inviting me tonight, or today, to share with you some thoughts on the exhibition of Cuban arts in the United States. I am sorry that I don't have a slides to show you. Really, what I have to do is a story, in a way, what I'd like to share with you. When Noelle asked me to speak here, I thought, well, I am an art historian who specializes in Cuban art, but not contemporary art. So what can I bring to the table? What can I sort of add to this wonderful presentation here? And I thought, well, maybe speak a little bit about the phenomena itself, the exhibition of Cuban art in the United States, which, if you have been sort of looking around the last 10 years, it seems something rather common, but it is not. In fact, it's something rather rare. Even though Cuba and the United States have a history of trade, travel, politics, all of that goes back to the middle of the 19th century, in actuality, in these 150 years, there's only been 2 decades where there has been actually cultural and artistic exchanges as far as the visual arts are concerned. The first was in the decade of the 1940s, and the second one is happening right now. In the 1940s, it took place under the auspices of the Good Neighbor Policy by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had a different thinking towards Latin America. In fact, the previous policy that presidents used towards Latin America was called the biggest stick. So you can imagine from going from the biggest stick to a Good Neighbor Policy was a relatively, softening and rather positive approach. And Roosevelt had in mind a cultural agenda. And that cultural agenda first materialized in the Riverside Museum in New York in 1939, when there was an exhibition titled Latin American Fine and Applied Arts. 9 countries participated. Cuba sent no less than 37 artists and 47 works. And this was the beginning of an opening. It continued in the 1940s, particularly through MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, through the workings of Nelson Rockefeller, who formulated something called the Pan American Union, which was money to be able to buy works from Latin America and bring to the United States, and Alfred Barr, the director of the museum then, who also took some interest in this, traveled to Latin America, bought and brought art to the United States. And in 1943, the Museum of Modern Art in New York held an exhibition titled Latin American Artists from the collection that was a very, very large exhibition with lots of publicity. And it was a continuation of this good neighbor policy as far as the arts are concerned, the visual arts are concerned. 1944, the Museum of Modern Art organizes its first and only exhibition of Cuban art titled Modern Cuban Painters. And that exhibition was very important because really is the beginning of an exhibition totally dedicated to Cuban art in this country, and no less than at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is a citadel, really, of modernism. In that exhibition, you have, let me see if I have here how many artists participated. Well, something, 71 works of art were shown, and something like 12 artists participated. At that time, the exhibition was organized on the side of Cuba by an up-and-coming curator called José Gómez Sicre. And José Gómez Sicre wrote a text for that exhibition titled Cuban Painting Today, which is the first text on modern art, the first book on Cuban modern art, both in English and Spanish, with color plates. At the time in the exhibition, it was sold for $1.75. Today, it's a collector's item, and if you find it, it costs $2,000. I mean, it's an incredible jump. And even then, there were problems with people traveling to the United States. Just like now, the Carpinteros were not given a visa to be here. A woman named Maria Luisa Gomez Mena that actually paid for this exhibition and funded everything about it and communicated with Alfred Barr to organize the whole thing, even open a gallery in Havana to facilitate all of this. She was negated a visa to enter this country at the time and could not come and was extremely mad about it and closed the gallery. And that was an early frustration of the beginning of commercial galleries in Havana to dealing with modern art. Then the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. became the spearhead of bringing Latin American art to the United States. And that organization formed a Museum of Modern Art that José Gómez Sicre was the director of, being recommended by Alfred Barr. And for a good 40 years, he brought a great many artists to the United States, to Washington, organized traveling exhibitions. However, at the end of the 1940s, interest in Latin American art died in this country. With the advent of abstract expressionism, abstract art, the New York School, there was very little interest in Latin American art. And then in 1961, when the United States breaks relations with Cuba, and in 1963, when it slaps a full embargo on the island, then no exhibitions could be held. And between 1963 and 1981, there are no exhibitions of Cuban art in the United States coming from Cuba. Things began to change in the 1980s. In the 1980s, a group of maverick curators, dealers, collectors began to try and find ways to bring art to the United States and exhibit art in here in spite of the embargo. The first wave of Cuban art came totally and fully supported by the State Department, the government of the United States. This second wave has been done against the wishes of the State Department and the United States by individuals who took it upon themselves to, in some cases, even break the law. And if not, at least skirt it, push it, and not go along with the idea of isolating Cuba. And it happened in two different places, in very different ways. One of them was in New York. A woman named Sandra Levinson, who very early on put together a nonprofit organization called Center for Cuban Studies, already in 1981 organized an exhibition titled First Look, 10 young painters from today Cuba, which was an exhibition, a catalog, and a documentary. And that was a beginning. Another exhibition that she organized along with the Museum of Contemporary Art, Museum of Hispanic Art in New York, was called Signs of Transition, Cuban Art of the 80s, and that was in 88. And in between, many individual exhibitions were held, artists were brought from Cuba, and an opening began to happen. At the same time that she was involved in this, there were others involved in this. There's an exhibition that took place in 1990, the first to travel the United States, titled The Nearest Edge of the World, that was organized by Rachel Weisz, that was then a curator at the Boston Museum, and Gerardo Mosquera, the most famous critic of the 1980s generation. And that was an important first too, because it traveled, and it began to expose Cuban art beyond New York. At the same time that this was happening, a group of intellectuals, curators, artists, gallery dealers, sued the government of the United States in federal court so that art would not be considered under the embargo and would not be considered under a law titled Trade with the Enemy Act, which means that you cannot have any business whatsoever with a nation that is considered an enemy, like Cuba. And they went to court, and finally, in 1990, the federal court judged in their favor. And art, the visual arts, and for that matter, music, and other items were allowed to not only be brought to the United States, but be sold in the United States. And artists could now have galleries and sell their work and receive money for workshops, whatever they do in this country. Interestingly, however, at the same time that this thing was opening in New York, in relation to contemporary art, in the least likely of places and the least likely of organization, also opened a crack in the law and the discouragement of bringing art to the United States to be sold. And that was in Miami. And that was a place that no longer exists, called the Cuban Museum of Art and Culture. By 1982, Cubans in Miami had developed enough of a sense of community, enough wealth, and enough interest in culture. They're now beyond the element of survival, to organize a museum, to be interested now in acquiring art. And when they were interested in acquiring art, they became interested in pre-revolutionary art. Their idea was a combination of identity and nostalgia to be able to have access to the patrimony of the island, but there was no art to be had. These things were not in the United States. They were not too easily bought here. And so this museum, in order to survive like all museums, they organize auctions, and they organize auctions as fundraisers. And in 1987, they give the organization of this auction to a faction, because a museum had, as always, everything has at least two factions, a conservative and a liberal one. And the conservative prohibited in the museum the exhibition of Cuban art for people that stayed in Cuba, were associated with the Cuban Revolution, or lived in Cuba. Okay? And so people like Mariano Rodriguez could not be exhibited, even though he was already dead, because he had stayed in Cuba. He was associated with Cuba. Wilfredo Lam could not be exhibited there either, because he had go back to Cuba. He's buried in Cuba. He was sympathetic to the revolution. And other people like Mendive, forget it. You couldn't exhibit, they couldn't sell, they couldn't do anything. However, they gave to one of the persons, the most liberal persons in this faction, they gave the organization of the auction that year. And this man took it upon himself to bring Marianos, to bring Wilfredo Lams, to bring Mendives, and to offer them for auction. He didn't tell the board until 2 days before the auction was going to take place. When he informed the board, over half of them got up and left in outrage. They went to the radio stations, they went to the newspapers. The whole thing exploded in a major controversy. However, the half that stayed in the museum, they said, we're going to have this auction no matter what. So they had the auction, okay? And people bought. People went and bought. Not always with good intent. I mean, everybody bought with good intention except for at least one person who went and bought a Mendive, brought it out of the auction house, put it in the street, and set it on fire to make a statement, okay, as to what was going on. So then the uproar was such that the FBI got involved. And the FBI began to investigate whether these works of art were actually bought in Cuba and whether any of the money went back to Cuba. But not only did they decided to investigate that auction, they decided to investigate the man who organized the auction. Okay? And one fine day, they went into his house, they broke the door, I mean, forcibly broke the door, went into his house. His whole collection of 100 and some paintings were taken away as evidence and put in FBI headquarters. His idea was, I'm going to fight this. And he put together the best team of lawyers he could possibly put together at a great expense, and went into the district court for South Florida and argued that works of art, the lawyers argued, were exempted from the Trade with the Enemy Act because they were informational material. And informational material cannot, is free. It has to go with the free of expression, free of knowledge, and so on. And so there was a big argument. There were all kinds of witnesses, expert papers, all of that. And lo and behold, the judge rules in favor of this individual and against the Trade with the Enemy Act, and exempts works of art from the embargo. This was 1989, and all of a sudden then in the United States, anybody can buy and sell Cuban works of art due to this ruling. At least in South Florida, that was the case. And one aspect of this story that never gets told is that it was actually that ruling in Miami that the federal court in New York used to rule in favor of that coalition of New York liberals that were trying to open and put a hole in the embargo and be able to works of art to flow freely one way or another. So this was a major battle that was won. And the reason you can go today and buy works of art of Cuba and buy CDs and buy just about anything you want around, that comes under the rubric of informational material. Now, as far as South Florida, that incident with the Cuban Museum of Art and Culture had two effects. One, I think, very negative, and one positive, okay? The negative was that since then, no institution in Miami has organized an exhibition of Cuban art because they fear that the same thing that happened back in '87 can happen again. A major controversy in the news that would bring all kinds of negative rather than positive publicity. And so that has been a problem. Only now, I learned a couple of days ago that Miami Art Museum, the biggest institution, public institution in Miami, is now organizing an exhibition on Wilfredo Lam, which should have been done 20 years ago, okay? And they're now putting a major show with Wilfredo Lam, so that's, I guess, a beginning of an opening. The positive side is that individual galleries since then have began to represent artists from Cuba. And you have, for example, Gary Nader, that has just closed a show of Mendive, the second one-person show of Mendive. Another was held 5 years ago. And the first show of Mendive, it was interesting because a person who took the painting and burned it on the street came into the exhibition, and in front of the cameras, I mean the Latin stations in Miami, shook the hand of Mendive and asked him for forgiveness, which was a major event, I think, for Miami. You have the Cernuda Arte Gallery that represents Sosa Bravo, Flora Fong, Fabelo, major figures in Cuba of the 70s and today. and also represents a dozen of other young artists that are really not known. You have someone named Alonso Arte that represents a wide variety of artists that live in the island and has exhibitions of them. Just a couple of weeks ago, Belen Jesuit School, a high school with a major, they have lots of money, so they have a huge art gallery, and they had the work of Carlos Esteves, I think is the name, an artist that lives in Cuba, a major show of about 50 works of art. And I can go on and on. Miami-Dade Community College now has a series, an ongoing series of photography from Cuba. No catalogs, but at least exhibitions and the artists, up until recently when travel has become almost impossible, came and to the exhibitions, to the openings. Last December, under the rubric of Art Basel, you have the Cuban Research Institute of the university that I work at, along with the Frost Museum, bring Tania Bruguera to Miami, the contemporary conceptual artist that was mentioned here earlier, to give an installation that a year before she had put in the biennial in Havana, in the National Museum, and no one even raised an eyebrow, okay, with catalog and everything else. And it multiplies. I mean, the Museum of Art in Fort Lauderdale started putting together a collection of Cuban American art, and now they have extended it to be also art from Cuba. And hopefully they're going to do an exhibition on the art from Cuba and further break the ice of a somewhat stagnant situation as far as public institutions jumping into it, not just the private institutions, not just the marketing of art itself. And in my very brief presentation, where I just wanted to kind of perhaps even raise some questions and raise some consciousness as to the historic, really, importance of the exhibition that you have here in Tampa today, I want to come back to this. And I think that it is very important that you have here a retrospective exhibition of a major group of artists with a major catalog that contributes not only to the exhibition of Cuban art, but to the scholarship on Cuban art in this country, which is also growing tremendously. I know of a dozen dissertations throughout this country on Cuban art, both modern and contemporary art, which has never, ever happened before. And so I'd like to congratulate both of you and everybody involved in this for two things. Number one, for furthering the exhibition and the scholarship of Cuban art in the United States. But secondly, and it's importantly, for going against the tide, being courageous, and organizing an exhibition and bringing artists like Segura and having exhibitions of Segura and having many other things that you have here, going against the tide of the isolation of Cuba, going against a political tide that wants to completely isolate Cuba, even from a state like Florida that had very close ties, a city like Tampa that has historical ties with Cuba going back for 100 years. It seems that is what should be happening. That should be the normal course of events. A city like Tampa is like a sister city to Cuba. And it's very normal, and it seems to me that it's the most natural thing that you be establish bridges rather than be cutting them, which is what our state wants us to do. And for that, I thank you and I congratulate you. Thank you.